All right. Well, thank you everyone for joining us this morning, this afternoon, this evening, or this night. I'm very excited to be introducing our speaker today, but before I pass it off to her, a little bit of housekeeping. Um, After our next talk is going to be again the first Wednesday of the month, and our next talk is going to be more of a molecular biology focus. So if you are interested in that, definitely stay tuned and keep up to date on our Facebook page and Instagram page to see who the next talker or speaker is going to be, and join us for that one as well. But today we have one of GBatNet's very own representatives and scholars with GBatNet, and it's Robin Rowland, who is a PhD candidate at the University of the Sunshine Coast, all the way from Australia. And so, without further ado, I want to go ahead and pass it off to Robin, and she will tell you a little bit more about herself and the work that she does. So, Robin, without further ado.
Thanks so much, Dana. And yeah, thank you to everyone for joining. I'm Robin, and I'm doing a really, I think, broad strokes picture of urban ecology of bats today. There's a bit of, yeah, mixed audience. People come from different backgrounds. So I am just going to be keeping it really broad. But if you have any questions, yeah, definitely let me know towards the end. What I think is most interesting about this field and what we're talking about today is how global it is. Every region has their own kind of unique experience that sometimes is the same and sometimes is really different. So excited to have all these different people learning more about urban ecology. So, like Dana said, I am a student representative through GBatNet, which is how I've met Dana at the first student meeting that I went to, which is a couple years ago now. I'm originally from the States, so I went to college in Florida at Eckerd College. And then now I live right where that arrow is on the green map of Australia and the Sunshine Coast, getting my PhD at the University of the Sunshine Coast. I've always been interested in wildlife-human interactions. I think that's really fascinating, but I definitely wasn't always a bat person. I got really into a lot of different species of animals over the years. Originally thought I liked more marine species, spent some time working with glowworms. And then if you can see that cute little flying fox on the bottom, that's how I really got into bats was just as a volunteer rehabbing little orphan flying foxes. And it's pretty hard to say no to a face like that. So that really got me interested in this general topic without existing interest in how animals are interfacing with humans, especially in spaces that we've created, like our buildings, our urban spaces. That's what has led me to the current PhD project that I'm working on. And as a representative for GBatNet, I'm also in a couple working groups really again centered on that theme. So I'm in a lot of groups that work on things like guidelines for people with bats in their houses or other buildings, guidelines on how to communicate about bats in a way that helps encourage conservation and human safety as well. And also some working groups looking at species that are really data deficient, which surprisingly is a lot of the species in Australia. We have a few that aren't even listed as a species, so you can't get more data deficient than that. They just don't exist on paper globally because they haven't been formally described or named. And you can see in this picture, I'm looking for one of those species there. This project's really focusing on or quite an urban area of Australia, but what I found is there's a lot of species that have been missed, and there is really little known in general about bats in urban ecosystems. So it's a really fascinating space because they're really just starting to understand that complexity and understand how little we know. But we do know that in general, urban ecosystems have been around for a while, and we know they're changing really rapidly. We can see this on satellite, which is really a great tool to visualize those changes. If you want to get really abstract, urban ecology is just studying how organisms interact with their environment in the context of some sort of city, but I'm really interested in peri-urban spaces. So we can see this map of Houston changing over time. It's a really great example of urban sprawl. And the peri-urban area here, all those kind of intermediate spaces are just as interesting and sometimes have really unique patterns going on. And I'm also interested in things like industrial areas on the outskirts of town, kind of really heavily degraded agricultural systems that have completely changed from the ecosystem it used to be. So urbanization doesn't just mean the city streets and that really dense city center. Urbanization changes an ecosystem and an environment really widely and tends to have really huge ripple and flow on effects. And what's so fascinating is working out how all of those changes interface with the wildlife that used to be living in these obviously a lot more connected, a lot more wild spaces. A really great example of urban ecology is this classic evolution example, actually. There used to be moths around the Industrial Revolution time that came in different color morphs. We'd had white moths and dark moths. And as you can see in this really great video from Butterfly Conservation, those dark moths used to get really predated on, but in the early 1900s, scientists started to find that instead of those dark moths getting eaten, all the light-colored moths got eaten because everything was just covered in soot. So not just people's lungs, bricks, trees, and the moths started to mimic that as well. As the Industrial Revolution started to kind of slow down, that smog started to lift. We actually have in our collection still a lot of great examples of these moths starting to get paler over time as legislation started to pass, as people started to change the amount of smog that was being produced, especially in Europe. So it's a classic example in this case of evolution, but for me, it's a classic example of urban ecology. So humans create lots of environmental change around them purely by existing, but especially in really densely urban spaces. And in those spaces, we do see flow on and ripple effects. Really visible ones in this case of moths that basically change color because all the light colored moths didn't really blend in with the smog. But we also see that in our wildlife and especially things like bats. We also know that this has been happening for a long time. So that's Industrial Revolution level changes. But obviously, for a really long period of time, thousands and thousands of years, humans have been walking around creating environmental change. And it's broadly called the Anthropocene. So, kind of this idea of it's a new geologic age. We can see it in the fossil record because a lot of wildlife will have gone extinct, changed its habitat, changed its distribution. We see that a lot with bats, but also other animals as well. As we move out of these geologic age of lots of available habitat, and instead there's quite a lot of cities and urbanization, animals have started to shift their range as well. Some are just going to die out if they can't shift, but for those that can, they're going to shift their interactions, their range to where people tend to be, because people tend to be most places these days. And we do see that those impacts vary. So, like I said, some species might just die out in increasingly urban spaces where they won't be able to persist in an environment that's really, really heavily urbanized. But there's some species that seem to do quite well. So, we've got a lot of cockatoo species and parrot species in Australia that don't mind hanging out in cities at all. Raccoons are a really great example of a generalist species that can kind of find homes and habitat anywhere. And there's plenty of examples of bats, including the bats at the Austin Bridge in Texas, that have managed to exist in really densely urbanized spaces. But it might not be quite as good for them. It seems to be really varied. Some seem to have really heavy impacts and increased disease, increased stress. Others seem to be thriving. And so that's what's so fascinating is it's not one size fits all. There's differences regionally as well as across different taxa, which is what makes it so fascinating. There's just so many unanswered questions. So traditionally, when we're talking about urbanization and what species are going to do well, we do think that things like generalists, like I said, the raccoon, are going to do really well because they're really flexible, tend to be really good at solving problems. They'll kind of eat anything, they'll live anywhere. They're pretty tolerant. And our specialist species, koalas are kind of a good example. They're really picky. And so we traditionally think of this specialist generalist thing in terms of these species, but I would submit that bats make an even better example because you're controlling for all this variation of, different orders, different families. You could just focus on this one group, Chiroptera, which is our bats. We have 1,502 species currently as of 2 weeks ago. So they're on every continent and they're really across this entire gradient. So it's a really great taxa to study because you can focus just on bats, controlling for other sources of variation, and still see these really specialized groups like Australia's ghost bat here on the left. Really sensitive to change, does not like disruption to their roost sites. And in comparison, we do have some generalist species that do really, really well in urban spaces. Understanding why they're so able to adapt is a really fascinating question that we're only starting to get into because there's still a lot we don't know about our bats. But it is a shame that we don't know more because this is not news that bats live in urban spaces. We have a lot of information, fossil records, we've got drawings, paintings, literature going back quite a long way showing that bats have been living near humans pretty much as long as there's been humans. Bats still tend to persist in areas like Mayan tombs, old castles in Europe, even kind of mud daub huts and those thatched huts in areas of Africa and Southeast Asia, where the structures have not changed for thousands of years. It makes sense that bats have been sharing these spaces. And in some cases, it's been such a long running relationships where bats and urbanization have been so linked that there's a few species in Europe where researchers can't find many examples of them roosting in natural roost. So they've basically been so used to these old churches and castles, and there's so few old growth trees and forests left to roost in that they've pretty much become obligate building roosters, which is really fascinating because obviously these spaces weren't built for them in mind, and how they're adapting to it and how that change is going to impact their long-term conservation, but also evolution. How are they potentially changing in response to our actions? Yeah, it's a really cool space. It also brings us really fun historical, drawings and paintings of bats. These are some of my favorite medieval illustrations of bats. Obviously, they're really ridiculous, but it really just shows how tied bats have been to human spaces, including really busy human cities, to inspire so many amazing medieval odes to their cuteness. This one's my favorite on the bottom right with that cute little grin. Now, when we're talking about how to define urbanization, it obviously did look a lot different, if we're talking about ancient Rome, than we are now. And studies really vary in how they define it. It's definitely one of the challenges if we're trying to get this global idea of how animals respond to urbanization. We're all using different definitions. So, one of the number one ways we can do it is actually artificial light. So instead of worrying about people and censuses, you can just use how much light they put out, measured by satellite. It is actually more problematic in areas with more cloud cover, just certain years that had more cloud cover. You can get a bit of issue with this measure, but it is pretty cheap and easy. But a lot of people are also using things like land use types, especially here in Australia. So it's basically local governments often map out areas, for example, a city where they've classified that as really urban. And quite a lot of studies are just using that. So they're saying, okay, government says this is urban, so that's what it is. Government says this is rural, so that'll count. What I've been really interested in lately is on the bottom right, you can see that's percent coverage of bare surfaces. And this is the same shot of the Brisbane River with 4 different definitions of urban. And a bare surface is anything pavement, concrete. It can even be really kind of artificial low grass. If there's absolutely no shrub and tree cover, that would count as bare. Water as well, obviously. Anything that makes bad habitat for things like bats that need trees to either live in, roost near, or forage in. And so for an animal like a bat, they might not care as much what the government thinks is urban, but they might care quite a bit that that industrial area in a rural zone has 0% tree cover. So that bare surfaces thing has come up quite a bit in some research recently. I think that's a really interesting way to define urban. There might not be a lot of people in that suburb, but if it's 100% covered in concrete, it's certainly going to have big impacts on local wildlife and plants. We can also look at things like tree cover and really old-fashioned way, just how many people are around. This works a lot better in regions that have really good census and up-to-date census reports. It doesn't work as well in areas that have, less available data about humans. But these are all come together in different ways, and a lot of research is basically interchanging them and starting to think about ways we can maybe combine them all, average them out. How can we best quantify our impact on animals if we're trying to do it on a broad scale, especially from a satellite? Usually when people are picturing, urban research, I just love this picture because this is Melbourne downtown, which is, here in Australia, we have really big populations of our flying foxes around Melbourne. So for an Australian, this would be what an urban bat would look like. It is usually going to be a fruit bat. They're really big and visible. They're quite loud and smelly as well. So a lot of people know about them, and they tend to roost in city parks in Australia. That's not necessarily the case for other fruit bats and other parts of their range around the world. For example, in Texas, an urban bat there is going to be quite a small little free-tail bat. So this definition even of an urban bat seems to change, but there's been a couple really cool meta-analyses trying to work out, what makes an urban bat around the world. Is there anything that really links all of these species? With 1,500 species, we know that some bats seem to be really excluded from anywhere where there's people, and some do quite well. And what a couple trade analyses have pulled out is it does tend to be our insectivorous bats or bats that use echolocation. Bats that tend to have kind of smaller body size, more flexible roosting seems to be quite important, higher wing aspect ratio, which tends to be something related to how a bat navigates in space. Is it really able to like shoot across the sky, or is it kind of good at adapting to clutter? In general, a bat that's more flexible in its roost type, maybe a smaller body size so it can fit in those kind of building roosts, tends to be quite good globally. But again, if you ask an Australian an urban bat, they'd say, no, it's that large body size because our flying foxes and our fruit bats are huge and they're really, really urban. So there's a lot of interesting work. There's been a couple global meta-analyses coming out lately showing some general trends, but one size doesn't fit all. A lot of times when we talk about ecology in general, I think we think a lot about conservation, we think a lot about threats, but I think a couple studies that have been coming out of Europe recently are really interesting, pointing to benefits of urbanization. For example, there's some work on the Cool's pipistrelle. You can see their skull here on the right-hand side, that have shown that according to museum specimens over the last 100 years or so, they seem to be getting a bit bigger. And they've been linking that to things like maybe roosting in buildings makes bats warmer, having access to artificial light that attracts moths. If you're able to tolerate that, if you're not too skittish of a species, may be able to get more food availability. So there's been a couple papers out recently, especially by Russo's lab in Europe, showing bats are maybe getting a little bit bigger if they're the kind of species that can handle urbanization. And there's been some really cool work as well in that same species, Cool's pipistrelle, showing that the urban bats had earlier birth times. So basically, the mother was able to get that baby out faster, give it more time before winter to grow up, and the babies did grow up faster as well. Which is really getting ahead of the game, especially somewhere where like Europe, where bats often have to either migrate or hibernate. Getting born early, growing up fast, making the most out of a summer is a really big benefit. So at least for some bat species, we're seeing some pretty clear benefits, at least in the short term. Growing up fast is really important. And another really kind of hallmark study in that is on Egyptian fruit bats. And they found some really interesting stuff around fruit bats in Israel. If they came from a more urban area, they performed much better in laboratory studies, where they could like learn faster, they took more risk, and all the studies of these cute little cubes where the bats could work out how to get in to get their treat. And they did some cross fostering as well to show that it's not just genetic. It's not like, they had exceptionally smart mothers. If you take a rural bat and give it to an urban mother, it will have those same traits over time. We're bolder and faster. There is a caveat though, right at the end of this study, which is just so amazing and cool. They were also testing the breast milk of the urban and the rural mothers to look at their cortisol levels, which is a hormone associated with stress. And they did find that urban mothers had higher levels of the stress associated hormone in their milk. So that they're also passing that on to that young as well. We don't really understand how the cortisol relates to learning very well. We do know that in a lot of species, it's related to things like disease, things like higher parasite load, potentially, impacting that animal's physiology. So there could be some benefits, but it is always a little concerning when you see higher stress levels, especially really, really big differences, what they found in this study. In general, we know that our species are going to change. And as urbanization continues to expand, that means that species diversity for all species, but especially bats, is probably going to be really shifting. And especially across a gradient, which is the thing I really am interested in, this kind of peri-urban, suburban gradient that this graph shows really well. And typically what we're starting to see emerging from lots of different papers and lots of different regions is there's something about that peri-urban and suburban space that tends to have maybe higher diversity. We have a couple studies in urban areas that show okay species diversity, but there's also starting to see a lot of shifts. And we do think what's happening is over time, as habitats get more and more degraded, if you're a sensitive bat species that maybe can only roost in a tree roost, or potentially you're not quite as bold and fast and quite as generalist, you might be pushed out. If there's very limited habitat in our urban spaces, really the only bats that are going to be able to survive and persist, it's probably going to be fairly aggressive, potentially a little bit larger than some of their other species around, or again, smaller to fit in the spaces that the other bats can't. So it might be pushing our species to extremes. And it may be that our peri-urban, kind of our suburb spaces that have a lot more green space is where we start to see our diversity. We certainly are seeing this in Australia. We have a species called the gold wattled bat, which has a bit of a reputation for being a bit aggressive with its nest boxes and bat boxes. And there's been some research showing that they may be pushing other species out of parks where they're roosting. Still early days. It's a bit too soon to say, but that would be really concerning to watch species diversity drop purely because of that competition that's artificially caused by humans. Because bats tend to live in these communities with lots of different species, all fulfilling different ecological niches. Especially, they're all going to be eating different prey items. So if a species that specializes in a disease-causing mosquito gets pushed out, then there might be less predation on that mosquito, which is bad news for us humans who don't want to get things like malaria, Ross River virus, all that good stuff. And I did want to emphasize that kind of extremes here. So if we're pushing bats to the extremes, if only the smallest or the biggest are going to be able to persist, that is going to look different across regions. In Australia, on the left here, our large fruit bats tend to be really highly urbanized. They're the largest bats we have on our continent. In other parts of Europe, the species that seem to be quite adapted to living in those churches and old buildings tend to be really, really tiny. So really small long-eared bats tend to be the ones that are the most urban in some of those zones. So those extremes may be regional or even continental. And of course, I mean, if we're talking about ecology, we gave urban spaces a bit of grace, but we have to admit that, of course, humans do tend to threaten conservation and wildlife. The Anthropocene, the age of man, the hallmark of it is mass extinction. So we know that with human habitat degradation and just human interference in general, we're starting to see some big impacts for our wildlife. So even though urbanization may have some benefits, may be benefiting certain species or the bats that can survive in those areas, it may also act as an ecological trap, which is this concept where an animal may move into an area because it's getting signals that this is good habitat. Maybe there's lots of artificial food around, lots of trash you can eat, or the case of our fruit bats, there's a lot of blossoms planted by local governments to beautify an area. Makes a park look really pretty if there's a lot of native flowers. And the fruit bats quite like a native flower for the nectar, so they'll move in for that food source. But the idea of an ecological trap is that the animal doesn't leave the environment because it doesn't realize that what's happening is potentially the gene pool is getting compromised. Maybe its babies aren't surviving. So if that fruit bat is there for the food, but then it keeps getting hit by cars, which we do see quite a lot of in urban spaces, a lot of unfortunately getting hit by road traffic, then it doesn't matter how good the food is if none of those babies are surviving. Equally, an urban space is also going to expose animals to higher levels potentially of pollution, pesticides, domestic pets, which is a massive threat, especially in our building roosts where bats are living right next to domestic pets. And that also can link to things like disease risk as well. If they're next to domestic pets, if they're interfacing quite a lot with humans, there's quite a lot of risk. So it might be that the animals that persist in urban spaces are exposed to a lot of secondary and down the road threats. A big one of these is really light. There's been a lot of really interesting work trying to look at not just how many species are light adverse, which is a lot of bats. Most bats don't really want to live in really light polluted areas. But for the ones that stay, how is that influencing their melatonin levels, for example, their stress levels? And it does seem to be kind of mixed results, but what we do know is that many species will just avoid areas with bright lights. So that means in a city park, for example, which might have really great habitat, might have a lot of mosquitoes or other insects we want the bats to be eating, they will be excluded by that light source. They're not going to want to hang out in areas with lots of, especially blue light pollution. The good news is if lights are shielded, so in this case, they're not the lights going up, lights that are shielded and lights that are more red and yellow tend to have pretty good impacts for the bats. They do tend to pick up bats in those areas. And a lot of research in urban spaces tends to use things like acoustics and some trapping to really passively monitor. Okay, if we are in this one city block and we do these different treatments of lights, how is that going to influence the species diversity and the prevalence of bat species around, which is a really easy way to do it. You have this really great experiment where there's lots of lights in a city. You have a perfect gradient usually where you can start surveying further away from light or further away from people as you move towards rural spaces. And that's where we've started to see some cool research coming out of, including here in Brisbane. Another big impact is bats, is just sound. So we all know that cities are noisy, but things like trains, industrial areas, even festivals are really known disruptors. There's a really cool study recently, 2021, that found that bats stop echolocating while trains are going past because it's so loud that there's no point in them trying to produce noises to find their food. It's just a waste of energy. So all the bats are going to go quiet. Same thing with frogs, actually. They'll go quiet as the train goes past. Once the train has passed, they will start hunting again. And that means in a busy area with a lot of trains, they're probably not going to be able to eat very much food. They probably won't be hanging out in those areas. For the festivals, we also notice they'll basically move away
So
from
I
an
missed the
area
pantry
with
door.
the festival because they definitely don't like the loud noises. It's not their favorite thing. It's either going to be really disruptive if they're trying to sleep or really disruptive if they're trying to hunt for food. And another really concerning kind of sneaky trap that could occur is genetic dead ends. So basically, gene flow inherently it happens when habitats are connected. There's a lot of connectivity in an area that's all forested. You can see on the top left of this image of Brisbane that it's really forested. So obviously bats could be moving in between areas to spread genes, create genetic diversity. And a recent bit of research out of this area was finding that bats that live in the middle of really busy cities in Brisbane don't have nearly as high genetic diversity as the ones in the rural areas. So it may be that they managed to get to that habitat and the habitat built up around them. Some trees were lost. And we may be seeing that in urban spaces, these bats are starting to really get genetically cut off from their surroundings. We've seen that in a couple other studies in other regions, but this kind of full cutoff of genetic connectivity is likely quite new. So again, even though bats have lived in urban spaces for quite a long time, in the last 100 or so years, post-industrial revolution as well, we've really started to see a shift where there is no connectivity. So way less green trees. A lot of cities in the world don't have a lot of tree cover. 30% tree cover is the kind of goal for the next couple hundred years for a lot of city planning, and most cities in the world don't meet that goal. So with less than 30% tree cover, a lot of species, including birds, frogs, insects, all these animals that use canopy cover to protect themselves from predation, which goes for lots of bats as well. They're not going to move in or out of an area anymore. They'll probably stick to kind of the outskirts of a city, and all the bats that have roost long term in the middle of the city are a bit cut off. And finally, just a preview of what hopefully I'll be working on in the next year or so is, does this cause impacts? So are the bats in these areas and these cities more stressed? And what does this mean? It's been really mixed results because it's really early days of people looking into this. There's a brand new study that's coming out of Reunion Island, which is a really cool kind of case study because it's a little tiny area where they can look at that urban gradient that was showing that the species that were living in really urban areas, a lot of them had higher urinary cortisol. They actually had linked that to viral shedding as well, which is obviously concerning for humans. We don't want bats that are out there shedding viruses, getting sick and dying because we need them for our ecosystems. We also don't want ourselves or domestic animals to catch those zoonotic diseases or spread them to our bats equally. And then another study in Europe, again, only in the last couple of years, these are coming out, starting to link that, at least in some species, they're seeing differences in white blood cell counts, which is linked to stress and immunity in urban spaces. But not all. So there's an Episticus, for example, a really common generalist species that does live in cities that actually had pretty normal white blood cell count and neutrophil lymphocyte ratios, which is just a measure we can use to look at, are they undergoing really large amounts of physiological stress? So potentially in some species, they're not being affected. They're doing okay. They're not stressed out by all the lights and the people and the interference. But it does seem to be some early days research showing that in other species, they're not coping. And that's really what I'm interested in around the Southeast Queensland in Australia, is looking at where bats are living in our cities and if this impacts them. The way I do urban bat ecology is pretty similar to what everyone else is doing. We're doing a whole lot of bridge and culvert surveys because a lot of bats do live in infrastructure. Same type of research that's done in a lot of areas, for example, of North American. It's just that in Australia, we're a little bit behind. So we haven't done nearly as many surveys. We don't really know what bat species roost in our infrastructure. So mapping that out has been quite critical just to work out what species we're working with before we can look at impacts. We're also looking into using iNaturalist quite a bit. That's definitely a global trend. People do tend to take pictures of things they can see. So bats have been really underutilized in that space where they're not getting nearly as much citizen science data as they could be. But we do have a lot of great tools now. So people can take photos of roost at their house really easily. They can also use things like echo meters, which is an ultrasonic microphone that again plugs into a smartphone, record bats as they're flying around or flying out of their roost. And if that gets uploaded to a platform like iNaturalist, we can start to map out exactly where bats are living. And we can also start to get an idea of density. So the more people that are volunteering this information, we can start mapping to see areas that have really high density of a certain species to work out what species are generalists, what species are getting excluded in urban spaces. At least in my area, they really use all sorts of habitats. So they'll definitely be roosting in houses, but pool umbrellas is a favorite of bats in Brisbane. They also use more classic wood bridges and infrastructure, and they'll be right in really busy cities, right under busy roads in those road culverts. So it does seem to be something they're a fan of. They've got some interesting tastes. So we've got some bats that live in, random spots, not just umbrellas, under live, laugh, love signs, was a roost I sampled recently. And locally, we're trying to use that research again to map out where the most common areas for bats to roost are, what the most common species in our urban spaces are, and what types of habitat are going to be suitable for them. And so we can build maps like this one, where if we look at that really busy city kind of satellite imagery, you can see in the center of that screen how urban that space is. It's really all bare spaces, all cities. And what our habitat models are starting to pull out based on a lot of citizen science data of where bats are reported is bats really aren't likely to roost, at least in these dense areas. They might fly through or forage around them. But if they're going to be roosting in something like a bridge or a culvert or a building, they tend to be in these peri-urban spaces. If it's an area like a national park, for example, on the left, they don't need to use buildings. They can roost in a hollow tree. So it's likely those areas are actually allowing bats to move back and forth and sourcing habitats for these species. They can either forage or roost in the national park. And if they need to roost in a man-made structure like a house or an umbrella, they can tend to live in those outskirts, those kind of edges of the suburbs, especially in older buildings. It's definitely a favorite. So again, just a broader scale, the type of modeling that we're doing, which is really seeing that if you're going to be living around the cities, you're going to be hanging to the outskirts. You're not going to be quite in the CBD. And then once it gets really, really rural, a lot of Southeast Queensland, for example, is quite green. They will again, potentially just go back to that more natural ecology, roosting in hollow trees, not really interacting with humans. So they're not getting picked up by our traps or acoustic detectors, citizen scientists. If no one's really picking them up, doesn't mean there's not bats there. But humans tend to detect bats where humans live. And so that's what that map's showing us for one of our local species in my research area. Now, I am about 4 or 5 minutes early, so if anyone has any questions, please let me know. But thanks for, listening, learning more about our urban areas. And I would love to hear if anyone has any anecdotes about, bats they've seen in their cities or any questions related to that. We have so many different groups of people here today. Thank you.
That was great, Robin. Thank you so much for that presentation. I think that was absolutely brilliant. So thank you so much. That was a great, like, broad overview about the topic, different ways of researching it and looking into it. We do have, it looks like we got a pretty good comment. We have a couple of things in the chat. So we have, what legal protections do bats have in Australia? In the UK, they have protected status of no touching. You have to call the Bat Society. So, what sort of legal protections do bats have in Australia?
So bats have the same legal protection as all other native Australian animals, which is not as much as they should. So they are protected in that you can't trade with them. You can't, buy or sell any bats or any bat parts. You can't keep any bats in captivity, like as pets, for example. That would be more for specialized rehabilitators. You can't damage or harm them or hunt them. But with that said, in Queensland, we've just passed legislation, unfortunately, again, that farmers can shoot flying foxes if they feel their crops are threatened. There's lots of cases of people excluding bat colonies either on purpose or accidentally and having zero reproduction repercussions for that. So they are nowhere near as protected as in the UK, unfortunately. And a lot of local governments are still working on figuring that out. So what we found is in this work where we're trying to get all these records of, well, where are bats in urban spaces, a lot of councils would, which is local governments, would tell me, oh, we have no records of bats in any of our bridges. And then I would like look back at wildlife hospital records and find that they did have bats in their bridges. They just got, damaged in construction. A lot of bats died. It got taken to the wildlife hospital, and no one at that local government wrote that down or kept that record. And it kind of got lost because there isn't a legal obligation
Hmm.
to prevent that harm. Whereas in the UK, you have to do all of those surveys and they will check and they will, make sure that you're doing that. So we unfortunately are light years behind the UK, sadly.
Well, we've got another question in the chat from Kim, asking their question from the Philippines. So, hello from the Philippines. So,
Hello.
we work with urban flying foxes here in our town. I shared in the previous webinar that we have found most of their roosting trees here in our town center are non-native species. We have not done any research on their movements via telemetry or GPS tagging, though, and we hope to do so if given the chance. But based on interviews, we are also able to confirm that they're on non-native feeding trees. What are your thoughts on this, especially on land management for removal of non-native and even invasive plants if those species have become primary roosting sites for things like flying foxes? In one of your slides earlier, there was something on invasive species, particularly cats. For this case on invasive plants, are we potentially creating an ecological trap by allowing them to stay, or is there a risk of immediate habitat loss from removal of a greater threat to the urban colonies?
Such a cool question. Definitely, you feel free to shoot me an email, Kim, as well. I don't do as much flying fox work, but I work with a lot of great people who do. Um, so happy to connect you. But essentially, there's a couple questions here. So first, bats in the Philippines and non-native trees. So in Australia, they can often use both for roosting. What they've really done to work out how much they rely on non-natives is actually looking at diet. So telemetry is going to be amazing, but also it matters what they're eating. And that was really important for a lot of bat conservationists to try and convince, again, the farmers that are trying to deter flying foxes with shotguns, to say, look, based on our research, 80 to 90% of their diet in a lot of their regions is native species. So they're not mostly eating your, mangoes. They do sometimes, but it's mostly these pollinating native plants. So maybe they're only roosting in those non-natives. Um, and my only other comment would be what we found in our urban spaces in Australia, at least, is they're roosting in those zones because all of our inland forests have been completely removed. So there are no other options. And it is almost certainly an ecological trap. But what is the alternative? Obviously, different regions have different amounts of rainforest or dense forest left, especially around Southeast Queensland. We don't. So in our case, mitigation is our best solution. We can't get them out of our city centers. But there's been a lot of really cool research showing if you basically cut a boundary of trees, so there's like just a little patch of bare space, sometimes only 5-10 meters in between a flying fox colony and people's houses, for example, that really cuts down on calls and complaints, which is directly correlated with how harassed those animals are, and how disturbed they are. So sometimes it's just a matter of, can we create like a buffer zone, to try and coexist? Because especially our large flying foxes, they need a lot of habitat, they need a lot of trees, and we don't have very many left here. Hopefully in the Philippines, it's a little bit more forested.
We've got lots of
So
questions in the
many.
chat. Yeah, I know. Okay, so I'm just working my way down the list. So thank you for this is from Alice. So thank you for a great talk. In regard to your analysis and research, did you find any way to stratify between bats that thrive on urban adaptation and those that have adapted but have been negatively impacted?
Thanks. Yeah. That's really like my third and fourth chapters of my PhD are going to be on that because that's what I think is going to be so cool. So we have been collecting fecal samples from three species to look at across a gradient and across different man-made roost types. Is there any difference in that fecal glucocorticoid, which is a metabolite of cortisol? It's a bit of a messy metric because basically the last couple studies that have come out in that space have contradicted each other. So we'll see. But what I'm really interested in is getting into that. And I think it's coming at it from a lot of angles. So, first, populations, second, things like stress, things like missing fur, alopecia, we see in some bats more than others. I think at the end of the day, if it's there in any numbers, that's still a win. And trying to again mitigate damage is probably better than focusing on, getting them out of an urban space. So I don't know if anyone's thriving out there, but I do know that the bats that, for example, can't live in anywhere where there's artificial light, like our ghost bats, but we also have some species that are really sensitive in Southeast Queensland. They're probably going to be the worst off. So if we can work out why the species that are at least persisting and can do that, that hopefully can help us mitigate some of that harm.
This is kind of this is a fun question that I feel like definitely depends on where you are.
Yeah.
What would be the most common answer to what bats take shelter in as human facilities?
So in general, smaller bats is generally the rule because our fruit bats, for example, will never roost in a man-made structure. So there's going to be those smaller species that can just fit in small places. Insect diet is the most common thing. There's a really great meta-analysis that came out 2 years ago where she just tried to look at every bat in the world that have been recorded in a man-made structure and what do they have in common. And yeah, small size, but as well free-tail bats. So it's a certain group of bats that's kind of flattened. They just have flatter bodies. They do tend to live in these big family groups of sometimes hundreds or thousands. That's the type of bat that lives in the Austin Bridge. And that pulled out as one of those kind of significant traits. So something about being able to eat insects, having a bit of a broader diet, being small, free-tail bats tend to live in people's houses. And that's the same here. So the bats that live in people's houses, a lot of the species I work with are about 8 to 10 grams, which is about the same as our pipistrelles, our big brown bats in North America. So really similar commonalities. And I do notice they tend to live in more general habitats. So your specialist rainforest bat that really loves to eat specialist rainforest spiders doesn't cope very well in a house typically.
Another question we got, when safe exclusions of bats are carried out from human facilities, do you know what the impact might be on that colony?
No, but someone needs to do this immediately. Absolutely. We do have a couple records of bats that were excluded and showed back up at the old roost, like even after sometimes months away. So they do come back, and often the same individuals are coming back, but we don't know what happened to them in the meantime and how that's impacting their health. We're about to publish a short note locally that was tracking rehabilitated bats, some that had been raised in care. So they'd never been in the wild. They were born to a female in care, usually again due to exclusions, like something horrible's happened to their roost. They had to come in through a vet hospital. And when we radio tracked those bats, all the ones that we were able to get signals for survived, were foraging, and they reintegrated with roost. So that's really interesting. But again, I'm sure that that's not the most fun experience. Those bats had to do that because something horrible happened. For all those bats that are excluded, sometimes not just because they had to, but just because people kind of thought they were annoying, we have no idea how that influences things like social structure, lifetimes, knowledge of a habitat, especially if they're illegally moved quite far off site. They have quite small home ranges. So we really need to be radio tracking bats that are excluded, and the people who are excluding them should be funding this because quite often it is, land managers and government bodies that are doing these mass removals, and we don't understand how that impacts their ecology at all.
Yeah, yeah. That's I feel like a common theme for much of
Yeah,
bat research,
a
right?
global problem.
Well, and that's why we have the Global Union for Bat Diversity Networks to try and help answer these hard questions. We're gonna do one more question and then we'll end it for the day because I know that we've been bombarding you with some really great questions, really great questions. So this one I think sounds like fun because it's definitely more Australia based. So you might be able to answer this pretty well. So, they say this is from Liz. So, thank you for a great presentation. I apologize if you've answered this. You mentioned that most urban bat species are smaller and insectivores, but that urban bats in Melbourne are typically thought of as a species of flying fox. Is there a reason the urban bats are larger in Melbourne compared to other locations, or are they smaller relative to other species in the area?
Uh, it's a bit of it's a great question. It's a bit of an accident. So it's just that our gray-headed flying foxes are the largest species that we have on our continent. They're just really gorgeous, fluffy, large flying foxes. They just happen to have a more southern distribution. Melbourne's definitely a hot spot. However, it's certainly related to the fact that in Australia we have chopped down every inland rainforest, eucalyptus forest for logging, and we have planted ornamental trees like bottle brush, like lots of lovely little flowers, grevilleas that these species eat. So we have basically, because they were quite pretty, like moved their entire food source next to people's front doors. And then people got quite angry because there were these loud, large fruit bats in their front doors. Same with our farms. So we chopped down the forest, planted a bunch of artificial lychee farms, and turns out fruit bats really like lychees. So the reason they're huge in Melbourne is because they should be inland in the forests around Melbourne, and those are all gone. So they have moved to an urban distribution because there's not much left. So we're in a unique situation where I don't think exclusion is possible. We're going to have to mitigate. Insectivorous species are probably going to have the same problem around the world. It's just they're much smaller and there are hollow trees around. So there are other options. Whereas for a fruit bat with a really high need to forage constantly for fruit and blossom, they need the whole forest to be there. So in this case, they need the whole city's botanic gardens. That's kind of the last remaining food source.
All right. Well, I know that we have more questions in the chat, but we are reaching the top of the hour, and we've been bombarding Robin with lots of questions that, with like really great questions and great responses. I feel like this was a really such a broad topic, and there's so many different avenues that we could go down with a research area like this. So if anyone has more questions, feel free to send GBatNet an email or get connected with Robin with any more questions that you may have. Otherwise, we're going to go ahead and call it here for the day. Let's go ahead and thank Robin again for being our speaker today. So thank you so much, Robin, for joining us, especially so late in the evening for you. And to everyone else who has joined us, whether you're joining us from the Philippines, the UK, Venezuela, or Indiana, thank you so much for joining us today. And hopefully you will join us again for our webinar next month. So without further ado, we will go ahead and log off from here for the day. So thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you. Thanks everyone for all your questions.